Hey, everybody. All right, Steve.
I'm here.
Steve, it's time for you to give us an impression. You got out of this a couple weeks ago.
I did. All right. I'm going to give you one. It's going to be terrible. Little Christopher Walken from Joe Dirt. You ready? Hey, you're looking at me all wrong. I'm stab you in the face with a soldering iron. That's all I got. That's it.
It wasn't bad. He's tough to do because I like Christopher Walken too. And it was really high pitched, like, hello, my name is Christopher Walken.
Yeah.
It's that like Walken.
Yeah. Walken. Stab you in the face with a soldering iron.
Stab you in the face with a soldering iron.
Yeah. You got it. Mine's terrible.
Well, let's start the podcast.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
All right, now that we have that awkward intro out of the way, Steve, this week, I thought we'd keep it pretty simple. We are talking about a specific post, and you probably hear us talk about all the time in our Facebook group. It's because we love it. We have this RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. When you search for it, RentPrep is one word, RentPrep. And we had a conversation come up, and Jessica, who's actually, I believe, local here in Buffalo, asked, what's your best landlord advice? Pretty simple question. But as of making this podcast, we've had about like 60 people at least chime in on it. And I thought we could go down the list. And you haven't seen the post yet.
No.
So I want to throw out some things here and get your reaction to them. Okay.
Yep.
So what is your best landlord advice? So let's look at the first one here that came up. Never make your last month's rent the same as a security deposit. What's your thoughts on that?
Never make your last month's rent the same as your security deposit.
Yeah, that came from Miss D.
So I'm assuming what Miss D means is that don't accept your last month's rent as the security deposit?
So yeah, there was some question on this, and what she had said was because your rent payment should be rent and the deposit should never be for damages. If a tenant leases up in April and they don't pay the rent, most say, okay, we'll just use a security deposit.
Yeah, terrible idea. So yes. I could tell you from a lot of conversations with landlords and seeing this firsthand plenty of times in the collections world, you do not want to bank on the fact that there's going to be no damages and you're not going to need that security deposit. And a lot of landlords, I think, in experience mostly, would easily say, well, yeah, we'll just use that security deposit. I have it. It's in hand. That's your last month's rent. But avoid that temptation because you will run into a situation eventually where that security deposit pays the last month's rent. They're gone. And then you go through and do your walkthrough and you go, oh, man, they kicked a hole in the wall. Oh, man, we got to replace this. We got to replace that. And you got nothing left. You don't have a security deposit to draw out of. So, and most leases are written with the language to explain that the security deposit is not meant to be used for rent.
And there's a reason there's a security deposit. It's a separate thing. So I think that's pretty good for that. I feel like most of the people listening to our podcast hopefully have distinguished it too. But if you are allowing people to use a security deposit to pay for the last month's rent, don't do that.
Don't do that. Tell them it's separate. It can't be used for rent. Rent's got to be separated. Now, in the event, this may be where there's some confusion on landlord's end. In the event that you evict somebody or they abandon the property and you're accumulating the damages and everything else, lost rent can be added into that and certainly be, the security deposit can be applied towards lost rent. But that's a procedural thing. That you're doing that in order. You don't want to take that out of order and say you're going to accept that last month's rent in the security deposit.
Okay. Here's another comment that we got in the same thread. It came from Amy, who says, always have an emergency contact with an exclamation point.
I like it. Yeah, I think so. For me, sort of related, the best advice I think I could give you in this topic is when you're having a rental application filled out, have them fill out their closest or nearest relatives, next of kin, however you word it on your application. These are not people you're going to be calling during the screening process. Nobody calls somebody's mom and says, are they a good renter? Or a brother or something like that. That information becomes very important when you need it. So in the event that they've skipped town or abandoned the property and you're trying to track them down, find their new address, find out where they're working, whatever you're trying to find information on, you're calling the nearest relative. You're calling mom and saying, hey, where's Eric?
Well, Amy's situation actually, hopefully she doesn't mind me sharing here on the podcast. I'm not really giving her full information, but I've messaged a little bit with her. She had a really bad incident happen where the tenant passed away in the rental, and she didn't have the next of kin or anybody who even wanted to claim the body.
Right.
So I'm sure when she's saying that emergency contact, that has a lot to do with it. And we've seen this too, where landlords, it's unfortunate, but it does happen that somebody can pass in your rental. And if you don't have an emergency contact or that personal reference that you can call, it makes things a little weird about where you go next with your first steps.
I don't want to scare landlords, but I swear to you, this topic of tenants dying in the rental property, tell me if I'm wrong. Do you feel like it's been more and more frequent conversation as of late? Like, I just feel like maybe because of the community, more people are talking about it, but I swear to you, it feels like it's happening more and more often that I'm aware of. And it's something that I remember when we first created a piece of content on it, probably in 2013, we just didn't have a lot of experience and have talked to a few landlords here and there, but it just seems like lately it's been a real issue and more people are dealing with it, or maybe they're being more open about it. So that's a great point. I mean, geez, I'd hate to be stuck in that situation where you don't know who to call. Yeah. You don't know who to reach out to. And that's tough.
A funny aside as far as this topic goes, because I feel like it's a pretty morbid topic, but I used to watch Saturday Night Live a lot growing up, and I always liked the weekend update that they would do. I think I saw one with Seth Meyers, and they're talking about how the oldest person in the world had passed away, and he's like, it's turning into an epidemic. This seems like this happens every couple weeks.
Yeah. The oldest person dies. Right.
Yeah. I don't know why I just thought of that while you're talking, because I'm a terrible listener.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. I can see you gazing away, and I'm losing you as I'm going. So, yeah.
Well, now you know how our podcast guys feel.
Right. I'm the long-winded one.
All right. So next comment here. I'd be interested to get your perspective on this. Jennifer, who's real active in the group, she said to make them get renter's insurance and put it in the lease that they must get and keep it, or else they are SOL.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Common misconception is that you cannot require renter's insurance. You can require renter's insurance as a landlord. I feel like it's very smart to do so. To cover you for all kinds of things. The one caveat I'll mention is that you want to make sure that your name as the landlord is listed on their policy. I've seen some issues in the past where landlord was never listed and some things weren't covered. So an insurance expert might be able to give a better explanation. All I know is that you want to make sure you tell your tenant, hey, make sure that my name is included in there, and it's the property address and everything. I'm being underwritten along with the property for coverage. I think that's an important element to it.
Hopefully, a little bit of a teaser here too on a future podcast. I've reached out. I don't even know if I told you about this yet, Steve. This guy, he created a video that went viral, like 50 million views or something like that, and he's an insurance agent in like Kansas or something like that. And the video was him eating this really disgusting food. And if his kids could sit next to him and watch him eat it and stay at the table, they would get a bike each or something like that. And his wife was there too. And the reactions were just like out of this world, just gagging. And like, I think only the one little girl was able to stomach it. And it went viral. And this guy's insurance agency is blowing up now because of it. So I reached out to him, and we're going to try to get him on for a podcast to talk about renter's insurance.
Cool.
Just because I thought it'd be a cool thing to get the video on that. And people could watch that on our website too. It's pretty funny.
I didn't know that. You don't tell me anymore. You don't talk to me.
Yeah. You just show up on the day. I do all the dirty background work.
That's right.
All right. Looking at the next comment here is from Mikey Mike, and he said an empty unit is better than an occupied unit with a bad tenant.
Best advice in there. I wish that more landlords thought like this. So important. I mean, dollar for dollar, if you were to sit down and spreadsheet this thing out, of course, you'd be able to make sense of it real quick that a bad tenant's going to cost you a lot more than having that rental sit vacant. It's just one of those things that when you're in that moment, you're in that position, you're in panic mode. You want to fill that vacancy. I get it. But resist all temptation to take what's available if you don't feel like that's a good fit. If you feel like you're making exceptions or you're bending or whatever to just try to fit a tenant in there because you don't want it to sit vacant again for a long time or the next month. Rethink your marketing strategy. Do a better job getting a better response. Go back to the drawing board. Let it sit for a month. You will not be disappointed in the long run if you do that, and make sure you fill it with the right person versus somebody who's going to be a nightmare for you. That to me is the best advice in the comments right there.
Well, you haven't heard all of them yet.
I don't need to hear them all. That's it. That's the one.
I agree. There is a pain involved with leaving a unit empty. But yeah, there's a bigger pain involved with evicting somebody. So that is great advice from Mikey Mike. In fact, 25 people liked it and gave it heart emoticons.
Understandably. Mikey Mike hit it right on the head there.
Yeah, I like that name. Mikey Mike.
Yeah, I need a cool name like that.
Yeah, we're just Steve and Eric. It's really not that great.
Yeah. We'll think of something for the next episode.
Yeah.
Big Steve. I want Big Steve.
Big Steve?
Yeah. I like that.
It's because you like Big Cheese or something, don't you? Isn't that from that show you like?
Big Tasty.
Big Tasty.
Yeah.
You want to be Big Tasty?
From Goldberg's, yeah. Sure.
I don't know if I want to call you that, but. All right. Moving further down the list here, we got a comment from Mo. And Mo said, be consistent. If your lease states a fine after 5 days late, don't deviate. Communicate everything during lease signing or before. I tell my tenants that if you're 5 days late, then you'll be charged $50 and then an additional $10 a day. If you go 10 days late, then I will post a 3-day notice. I let them know everything up front and then follow through.
Great advice. Regardless of what your policy is, I think the important part, what Mo mentioned, is being consistent. When tenants know they're dealing with a professional landlord, it's much different than dealing with Eric down the street that they can talk into letting you pay rent late or whatever.
I'm bad at that.
Yeah. So
those emotional sob stories. There's a couple comments in here about just ignoring emotional sob stories, and that can be tough if you got a perceived big heart.
Treat it like a business. Play good cop, bad cop if you have to. If you're the landlord and you're making the decisions and you're not comfortable saying certain things or holding people to certain things, then be the manager and tell them that you're not making those decisions. Sorry, that's out of my control. I have to charge that to you or whatever. Remove yourself from that if you feel like you can't do it.
Yep.
But it's so important to be consistent in the fact that you're setting an example, you're setting a tone right from the beginning. Best example I can give you is when renters pay late, there's certain things that we all know that we cannot pay late, right? Credit card payment, car loan, you're going to get nailed on late fees. You're going to get, your car's going to get repossessed. There's consequences to it. But if they know that they can talk their landlord into paying their rent late, if they do it once, that's going to be something that's going to come back and haunt you again and again and again. So stick to your policy and be consistent. Great advice there by Mo.
All right. Here's one I feel like is kind of, I feel like I'm kind of just throwing you a softball here because I might know what you're going to say to this, but follow your gut instinct. Debbie put that on there.
Oh, Debbie.
I feel like this is like for somebody who owns a background check company.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
So it's kind of funny. I think a lot of people are surprised when I talk to landlords and tell them don't discount your gut feeling because background checks are so data centric and so data driven. But I understand the real formula, the good formula, the right recipe in finding a great tenant is really 2 parts data, 1 part gut feeling. And it's important that you're cross-referencing that gut feeling with the data. Don't go with your gut feeling first. Run the background check. See everything sitting in front of you, know the story, then you could start trusting your gut. But I've heard some fantastical stories about tenants that have pulled all kinds of fast ones on landlords, and most landlords come away saying the same thing. He seemed so nice. I never saw this coming. I fell for it. I went with my gut. I was wrong. Listen, our gut feelings are not 100% solid. That's why there's a formula in place there.
Well, I think with the gut feeling things too, it's kind of like, maybe this analogy is probably a little too stretched, but I love my analogies. The finding that perfect renter to me is kind of like almost like finding the person you're going to marry. And I think about like how many times I was wrong in my gut about the person I was dating, where I was like, oh yeah, this person's like such a great fit. Not that that person was a bad person, but they were just a bad fit for me.
Sure.
But I was just doing it all based on gut and feelings. And I look back, I'm like, yeah, like my gut instinct wasn't always spot on. It worked out for me in the end, but as far as like these people trying to find people that they think like, yeah, I'm perfect at that. It's like, I think you can look back in your own history and think about how many times maybe your gut instinct wasn't right. And I think there's also kind of an ego that comes into play where you want to believe your gut instinct is amazing and you're just perfect at it, but we're flawed.
I was just going to bring that up. Ego. Perfect. Yeah. And maybe landlords aren't aware of it, or the fact that maybe they're letting their ego get in the way, or they think that they know it all. I think those are the landlords that get burned the worst. There is a little bit of humility and self-awareness that comes with landlording anyway. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I think that you should really be self-aware of is that you may not have the greatest gut instincts, and don't trust just your gut instincts. And it's tough. I do, we interview screeners for jobs here at RentPrep, and hiring is tough. And a lot of times I want to go on a gut instinct. I want to go on that initial reaction of meeting them, shaking their hand. But we've hired a lot of screeners, and I've seen a lot of them that you hire and you had the highest hopes for, and something doesn't end up working out or whatever, and you sort of learn over time. But the one thing I've learned for sure is you can't go just on a gut instinct of whether or not I feel like this person's going to work out. It's a huge letdown when they don't, first off. Talk about a huge blow to your ego. Like, man, I was wrong. And you got to,
it's all right. Our brains are just designed to just protect ourselves and be like, no, actually I was kind of right all along and I knew it. And, I'm fine. I'm good. Yeah. That guy just messed up.
Right. This guy just was terrible. Yeah. But it's our responsibility.
All right. Next one here. No idea how to say this person's name. It's not actually that difficult probably, but when you're as poorly educated as I am, it can be. So I'm guessing Yona, Johnnna. It looks like John with an N-A. What would you think? Jonna?
Yona.
Yona.
Yeah.
Yona said, don't rent to your friends.
Oh, good advice. It's the same reason why I don't hire friends. Sorry, Eric. We were acquaintances, really, not really friends when I hired you, right? I'm sorry, man.
You, Steve.
It's pretty sound advice. The worst thing in the world is to have to fire your friend. I got to imagine the second worst thing is having to evict your friend.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know which one would be worse, to be honest. One's your income, the other one's your housing.
Yeah. The fastest way to lose friends is hire them and rent to them or live with them, To me, I feel like friendship and business should be kept separate. I've had so much experience in this. Starting a business, starting several businesses. All I hired was friends at first, different businesses. It just made sense to bring in my circle of people and
trust them.
Yeah, I trust them. Those are the people I work with. But very rarely do you come out unscathed. Very rarely do you come out of that situation with the friendship still intact. So
it's like college too, when you're that age and I remember I had one friendship where I was great friends with this guy freshman year, and I commuted, and I was great friends with him my sophomore year when I lived at the dorms and had different roommates, and I lived with him my junior and senior year. And I was like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God. And he probably had the same perspective on me because we probably just didn't gel.
Yeah.
But living with him was bad. And then I didn't learn my lesson because when I got my rental, I lived with friends. I rented to friends downstairs, which actually worked out great, but there was that separation. And then I rented to some friends too. And the thing that was tough for me was being able to cross that friend boundary of being like, hey, you're late with rent, or hey, your girlfriend's over all the time. She's clipping her toenails all over the apartment. And then it's like, are you being the friend? Are you being the landlord? And then where are those lines drawn?
Yeah.
Like that was really tough, especially because I was not only the landlord, I was the roommate and the friend. And it was just kind of looking back at it.
And again, I feel like it's kind of an easy way out, right? For a landlord, like, I know this person's looking for a place, and I can skip the listing process, and I don't have to do the interviews. You know what I mean? Like, you
got an idea of their background.
Yeah, don't do it. Just don't. That's my advice. Just don't do it. So great advice there.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So Caitlin says they should make 3 times what the rent is.
Yeah. So good advice. I think the standard is kind of fluctuates between 2.5 and 3 times the monthly rent. We're talking gross. 3 is definitely the safer play. I think that's great advice. Definitely stay on track with that, and then just make sure they don't have any other expenses that aren't maybe necessarily immediately obvious. I'll give you a couple of good examples: a wage garnishment, child support. These are all things that come out right as rain. There's no getting away from them. They're going to come out month after month, and may not be considered when you're looking at somebody's expenses that they're listing to you and telling you what they're paying for their car and things like that. So definitely something to consider. And again, 3 times I think is the safe number for sure.
Yeah, and just a little caveat to throw on that is if that renter has a Section 8 or they are on Social Security or things of that nature, you don't want to just be looking at, all right, what is your income from your job?
Yeah.
So you want to consider those things as well as part of your screening.
And why is that important, Eric?
Because it's illegal.
Why?
Because it's considered income.
Yes, and income, you cannot discriminate against the source of income.
Yes.
So yes.
Yeah, I know you were trying to pull that information out of me and it wasn't happening.
I know.
Yeah, I'm not that good.
Yeah. So no discriminating against source of income. If they're on Section 8, that changes the equation a bit.
Or when it's called what, the housing voucher?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, depending on where you are in the country.
Okay. Moving down the list here. We have, actually, I haven't even read all this, so I'm going to start reading it. Maybe it's not a good one to read.
Okay. All right. Throw a dud in there.
You know what? This is from Johanna again.
Oh,
Johanna, we love you.
I'm a big hockey guy, so a lot of Swedish are like Johansson,
Is that usually a first name or last name?
It could be either.
Yeah.
Johan.
Right.
Johan's
Johan.
pretty popular.
Johan.
Yeah.
Says, stick with property management if you don't have the time to deal with move-in, move-outs. We ended our contract with our property management because they sucked. And we thought, oh, they're friends, we can manage. All has been good up until this notice of termination to do selling, and now emotions are involved, and no property management to be in the middle man for me.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes down to your individual preference as a landlord. And again, some of that self-awareness that we were talking about where, and Eric, I don't want to throw you under the bus here, but you're sort of in that area right now, right? Where I think you're considering property management maybe?
Oh, I consider it all. I consider just keep on going with the status quo. I consider property management, and I consider just selling.
Yeah. So I think a lot of landlords are kind of stuck in that limbo of like, well, man, my life would be so much easier if I didn't have to come here and mow the lawn. My life would be so much easier if I didn't have to show these apartments.
Well, we should explain too that I've had a great run lately. Mm-hmm. I got the 2 rental units and I have had no problems, no issues. Occasional rent being late or something like that, but like over a year. Yeah. Just because I just renewed the lease and I was like, geez, I think it's like been over a year since I've had any issues. In the last 3 days, I've had a fridge break, a wash machine break, and then my own toilet at home overflow over the floor. And it was like 3 consecutive days in a row. So I think in those moments, all of a sudden your perspective shifts a little bit. And it's just like, you know what? I could probably get a good buck if I sold this place.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's very easy to overlook, like, oh, look at all the passive income that happened for a year with no problems or issues because you're just having a tough 3-day stretch.
Sure. Maybe the best advice there for Johanna there is, take a step back and take the emotions out of it and really look at the big picture. And maybe it makes sense to get a property manager. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're in a bad stretch right now and things are going to get better and things, have been good in the past and you're hitting a bad stretch here.
All right. Next comment. This one comes from Jonathan, who's real active in the group, and he actually helps us as a moderator. And he's a cool dude. I've messaged with him a bunch on here.
Cool. Thanks,
I think
Jonathan.
he even gave me a donation to the Empire State Ride thing that I posted in
nice.
there.
I like this guy.
Yeah.
All right.
He said, choose your battles wisely.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah.
It's like a life lesson.
Yeah, man. That's a marriage advice. That's great. I was just reading, it's funny, I was just reading an article like, the surprising secret to a long marriage is actually not communicating. It's choosing your battles and, choosing what not to have an argument about. And I think that's pretty accurate, actually. I've been married close to 15 years.
Something like a clickbaity title, though, that you see. Like, secret to a good marriage is not communicating. You're like, what?
Yeah. You're like, I've been doing it right all along. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's tough sometimes. For some landlords, I see are brutal with picking and nitpicking and they end up driving the tenants away.
Oh, hopefully she doesn't listen to the podcast, but there's a member in this group. I don't know if you saw this, but she was getting on her tenants because they're doing such a bad job with weeding the garden beds and the sidewalk. And I was thinking about it. I'm like, I own my own house. I do a terrible job with that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I just couldn't fathom like making that a battle with my tenants and being like, guys, you got to do a better job of weeding the sidewalks.
Right.
Like it would never fly.
Yeah. Pick your battles. If you got a great tenant that's a potential long-term tenant and they're not the best weeders, you can look past that and find a way around it. Buy a bottle of Roundup or whatever you got to do and do it.
Well, I went through this emotional process a little bit of when I left my rental. I think it took me a good 6 months to a year to just now be looking at it like a rental because I lived in the one unit. So I think there's also some of that some people have, and probably especially your DIY rehabbers who are putting all this effort, money, and their own elbow grease into these rentals. And then when they see the way that these renters treat them, like they're treating like it's a rental.
Yeah.
And they're like, why can't you realize that I spent 2 hours cleaning that with a toothbrush?
Here's a great story. I remember this woman called me one time and she was stressing out and she was so upset about the front door being broken. Okay, of this rental. And so after a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation with her, I started to really realize what the main issue here was. The issue was she used to live there. Mm-hmm. This was a $3,000 front door that she put on the house. And she's upset that the renters aren't treating it like a $3,000 front door. Of course they're not treating it like a $3,000 front door. But there's a good example of you're emotional for pretty good reason. You know, I mean, you owned it and you lived there and you loved it. And now you're giving it to someone else to live into and you expect them to treat it the same way. Mm-hmm. And they're unrealistic expectations a lot of times. So, you know, the right answer there is take the $3,000 door off. And if you love that door that much and maybe see it in the future at that house or whatever, take it off, put it in storage, buy a cheaper door so that is not a stress in your life anymore. You know what I mean? There's little things like that you can pick off.
I actually it's not the same exact thing, but when I was living at the rental, I didn't follow one of these rules and I had friends living upstairs, which actually has worked out phenomenal. So just goes to show, it all depends on your situation. But the one thing that wasn't great was they were both door slammers. Mm-hmm. And like, it used to drive me nuts. Because I'm like very like noise sensitive. I'm just a sensitive guy in general.
Yeah,
but
you are.
I know.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things where I realized one day, I'm like, I just got to pick my battles. I'm not going to sit here and try to correct somebody on the way that they close a door.
Yeah.
Right. And what I did do is I got some of that, it's like weathering strip that comes in a roll.
Yeah.
And I took it and I asked them if it would be fine and just like sneak into their apartment and do it. And I put it on the door jamb of their door. So their door is still closed, but instead of it just being wood on wood really hard, it was just hitting that weathering strip and it just softened the noise. So I figured out stuff like that I could do or just make things more enjoyable. So figuring out what you can control and just take action on that.
Right. It's a great piece. I like that.
All right. Here's one from Irene, who also is pretty active in the group. She said, also, no matter what anyone tells you, and then she put in parentheses, all good advice here on this site, which isn't always true. It says, make sure you check your local, federal, and state laws. Things in Connecticut are not the same in New York or California, etc.
Yeah. Connecticut, Massachusetts in particular are two pretty regulated states when it comes to how landlords have to deal with tenants. Massachusetts is a nightmare state for almost all industries. It's funny. No matter whether it's
funny we're not in Massachusetts.
Yeah, exactly. But, I understand the struggle and of course we get licensed and everything else. And Massachusetts is definitely a tougher state to go through that process in. So I get it. It's definitely a state that really, really looks to protect the consumer, the tenant, you know what I mean? So a lot of people will tell you like, oh, Massachusetts is not a landlord-friendly state. But I think it's just a matter of knowing your local laws. That's great advice by Irene there. Definitely know your local laws. Certain it definitely comes down to not only state, but certain municipalities. We live in a area in the suburbs of Buffalo where something that might apply to a suburb 5 miles outside of Buffalo doesn't apply to a suburb 5 miles north of Buffalo. And it totally changes.
I think that was transgender. There was rules on them becoming part of a protected class, but it really was like town specific.
Yeah, it was Hamburg and West Seneca, right?
Yeah,
it was something. So. Yeah. So those of you who are not in the area, those are suburbs of Buffalo, and you would think like, oh, that would be across the board, the whole state, but it's not. It's based on towns and municipalities. So definitely a good idea to get friendly with your local town clerk.
Yeah.
Call them up. What do I do? What do you guys have your own set of ordinances on what landlords' responsibilities are? Most towns do. And it's good to know those.
Actually, Asada, she commented on this and she said, I agree. In New Jersey, tenants have 30 days to come up with the rent before you can file any eviction for non-payment, regardless what your lease says. Now, I'm not saying that's fact, but I'm willing to bet that she knows this and she commented on that.
Yeah.
So it's like, I've never heard of that, but that's, if you end up filing that eviction notice too early, and that is the case in New Jersey, then
there's all kinds of state nuances like that. Like Massachusetts, you cannot legally charge an application fee or any upfront fees. California, you can charge an application fee, but it can't exceed $49.50. So it can get very specific and meticulous.
Well, like California, you can charge 2 months security deposit. If it's furnished, you can do 2.5 months.
Right.
And I think there's even a caveat in there. If they have a water bed, you can get up to 3 months.
Yeah.
I was like, so it gets pretty specific on the rules and regulations.
Yeah. Don't let it scare you. I mean, just
Know your stuff.
Take a moment to learn. Yeah.
All right, everyone. I'm just kind of interjecting here because this thread is awesome. There's so much great content in here. We couldn't fit it into one podcast, so we're gonna call it a day on this podcast for this week. But we're gonna join up next week and we're gonna continue going down this thread and talking about the best landlord advice. So we will see you next week.
Oh,